Yippee yippee jibbee, yippee yippee jibbee, yippee yippee jibbee, yippee yippee yippee, yippee jibbee, yippee yippee yippee, yippee yippee yippee, yippee jibbee. Part 2. At 5 o'clock on a hot midsummer's afternoon in 1875, the SS Northbrook, 21 days out of Southampton, berthed in Table Bay Docks, Cape Town. In the captain's cabin, Jack Farson stood in front of the desk, at which Captain Woods was seated. Both men were sweating freely. "You are a fool, Farson," the captain said. "The place is rotten with people like you. We've come to dig diamonds and failed." Above the creaking of the ship's timbers, Jack could hear the cries of seabirds and shouts from the bum boats. Captain Woods was a short, florid man in the white tropicals of the Castle Line, with a wing collar and a black tie. He had a ledger on the desk in front of him. "90% of the passengers in the ship will be penniless in a month. Half of them will die on the diggings. Still, it's your business. I make it £12, 13 and 6. Sir, it should be nearer 40. The captain looked down at the book. "Hammer and Scrapper lost overboard before we left the port. Then you had tobacco 3 times. And you were drunk twice. A shop window broken in Madeira. Sir, that wasn't me." "The mate says it was." "Sir, that's all, Farson. If you are unhappy, take it up with the company." Jack pocketed the money, slung his sea bag on his shoulder, and turned to go. "When you've found your diamonds, you won't worry about a sum like that," Captain Wood said, shutting the ledger with a snap. Jack went to the gangway. The crush of passengers trying to disembark was 5 deep. Most had come to dig for diamonds at Kimberley, which the dry diggings were now called. The SS Northbrook, the diggers' special, 15-pound bought you a bunk in the hold, 10 square feet for your baggage, and as much tea, bread, and tough beef as you could manage. Was one of dozens of ships from all parts of Europe and America bringing men to the scene of the greatest diamond rush the world had known. There was a great feeling among the passengers of haste, almost of panic, to get on with what they had come to do, to reach the mines, to start digging, to get rich quick. The object was to get there before the next man, before he dug up the wealth and left you with nothing. But Cape Town was more than 600 miles south of diggings, and there was still a long way to go, a long way to hurry, a long way to race your neighbor. Speed, speed. Jack Farson, too, was caught by the feeling of urgency. He was in his early 20s, a big man, raggy, ginger-haired, and freckled, with a square bony frame that looked as though it had been cast in a foundry. His hands were large and as hard as boot soles from pulling on 1,000 ropes. He had been to North and South America, to most of the ports of Europe, and twice to Australia. No matter where he had journeyed, his goal had been the country that now lay before him. Sometimes he had thought he would never reach Africa, or that all the diamonds would be dug up before he got there, and his frustration would boil up into a helpless anger. But then he would hear of new and richer strikes, and ambition would burn again. Now the excitement and aggression of the crowd round the gangplank infected him. The diggers came from every country and walk of life, some in sooty suits, some in jacket, shirts, and knee breeches, carrying picks and shovels from the gold rushes in Bendigo and Ballarat. Chronic diggers caught by the panics to get on, to get there first, to snatch their wealth from the hard stony soil. Jack's mood was heightened by a sullen anger at what he thought was sharp practice on the part of Captain Woods, and he pushed his way to the top of the gangway with scant regard for his fellows. Some turned in irritation as they felt his elbows, but when they saw the big, gaunt man with a face like a sandstone cliff, they edged away and let him through. The press on the gangway was uncomfortable, but the dark side was worse for year. Mixed with the disembarking diggers were porters touting for customers, servants from city hotels singing the praises of their establishments, Cape carts, the equivalent of the London hansom cabs, picking up and dropping fares. There were pickpockets and whores and fishermen returning from the day's work. Everyone was shouting and pushing. In the midst of this, not surprisingly, an altercation had broken out between two of the passengers. Jack tried to ignore it and push through, but people on the queue rushed to see what was happening, and those on the gangway were unable to go forward or back. Jack, who was on the lower step, recognized the two men involved in the quarrel. He had seen them frequently, although never together. One was of medium height and wore a dark city suit and a white Panama hat. Jack had noticed him during the voyage because he read books and kept himself and never was seen without his hat. The other man was a big bearded Welshman called Williams. Jack knew his name because he and a stocky Scot called Mackay were two of the troublemakers of the voyage. Both men had been frequently drunk, and once Williams had vomited on Beat Jack. Outside the main saloon, the first officer had ordered Jack to clean it up. The quarrel had broken out because the young man in the suit had accidentally knocked into the water a package belonging to Williams which contained two spades. "It was an accident," he was saying. "I'll be glad to pay you for them." "You bloody Jew boys think you can buy anything and anybody with your money." "They were only spades. I mean, they weren't your spades, Jew boy." Williams began prodding him on the right shoulder. Short, sharp jabs. They sent him backwards. "Give them room," someone shouted. "Make a ring." "Give him a lesson, Taff," a voice shouted, and Jack recognized that it belonged to the Scot, Mackay. Williams and his victim were at the bottom of the gangway. Jack was crushed as the young man backed into him. The anger that had arisen in the captain's cabin, combined with the memory of cleaning up William's vomit, caused him to say, "Give over. I'm going to teach him a lesson. Give over. You mind your own bloody business." Jack hit him. People who saw it said at first they thought he hit him with a leg of mutton or a shoulder of pork, so big did his right fist seem. Williams went down like a felled tree, but instead of a cheer there was a hush. Men looked at Jack, muttered to each other, and then began to disperse. Soon he was standing by himself as Williams was helped away on rubbery legs. Thank you, someone said. Jack shook himself. For several minutes he had been unconscious of his surroundings. Rage had transported him onto a different level. Had Williams not fallen instantly, he would have been on him like an animal. His vision cleared and he looked at the young man. My name's David Cade. They shook hands. Jack Farson. Are you going to the diggings? Jack swung his sea bag over his shoulder. Yes. Perhaps we'll meet there. Perhaps I can repay you. Jack turned towards the city that lay under Table Mountain. He had not gone more than a few yards when he felt a hand on his arm. Excuse me. He turned angrily. He did not want more thanks. He had not done it for Kate's sake. But this was a different face, lined, sunburned, a face of the country. He looked at a man who had once been his own size, but who now in middle age had shrunk inside his skin. I saw what happened, the man said. I heard what you said. I can take you to the diggings. Why? I've come to fetch a water pump. It's in the ship. I need a strong fellow to help me get it into my farm. Where's that? Near the diggings. How long will it take? 2 months? A bit more, perhaps? Jack shook his head. The coaches take 10 days. He began walking away. The man walked with him, and Jack noticed that he limped. They cost money. I've got money. If you change your mind, ask for Delport, Franz Delport. I'll be in the wagon park on the Grand Parade for two more days. At the bottom of Adderley Street, the main street of the town, Jack paused. Rearing up ahead of him was the great slab-sided block of granite called Table Mountain. A southeasterly wind was blowing, and a tablecloth of white cloud obscured its top. The town was compressed between the mountain and the sea. It was geometrically patterned. The streets at right angles, the buildings formal and of the same height. He walked up into its center. Cape Cods clip-clopped up the unmade streets. Fishermen in conical Malay hats blew fish horns to announce their catch. Flower sellers lined the pavements. The shop windows were filled with goods that had been brought from Europe. The Cape at this point in the 19th century was a British colony and Cape Town itself a bustling seaport, busier than it had ever been because diamonds had been discovered in the hinterland, and it was the main port of entry. It was an admixture of half a dozen cultures, black, white, and mixed. Jack knew none of this and could not have cared less. Cape Town, for him, was an irrelevancy on his journey to the diggings. He found the office of Messrs. Anhals and Co., who ran the coaches between the Cape and the diamond diggings, and stopped in amazement at the crowd around the doorway. It appeared that everyone in the city was trying to jump the queues that stretched halfway around the block. He pushed with the rest, but it was half an hour before he stood, sweating, dusty and hot, in front of one of the small brass grills. The ticket clerk was just as hot, and his stiff collar was limp. Single or return? The clerk said. Single. First date in 3 weeks? Ain't you got nothing sooner? Not a blessed thing. How much? 50. Quid? Pounds. Sterling. Jack was stunned. With the £12 he had been paid that morning, he had a total of just over £27. He had thought that 10 or, at the most, £15 would pay for the journey. That's bloody robbery. You want it? 50 quid? Next. He turned away angrily. At the next window, he saw a familiar face. It was the man from the docks. His white Panama was on his head, and he was shuffling 5-pound notes over the counter. Jack watched bitterly. They were all getting ahead of him. He had a meal at the London Hotel in Green Market Square, and then walked down to the docks. He had no alternative now but to take up the farmer's offer. He had heard of men walking to the diggings, but the wagon, slow as it was, would be better than that. But Fransdal Port was not to be found. Then he recalled he had spoken of a wagon park on the Grand Parade, and was directed there by the first man he asked. It was an open space about the size of 3 city blocks. Trees bordered one end, while at the other there were flower sellers, fruit sellers, farmers selling mounds of yellow pumpkins, and old Hottentot women selling scrawny hens. Dusk was falling and lights were being lit. Photographers were packing up their booths, and the snake charmers were unpacking their mats and setting out their round baskets ready for the evening's entertainment. He was reminded of the new cut in Lambeth. The main difference was the heat. Here, people's faces shone with sweat as they strolled through the hot, dusty darkness. Over the heads of the crowd, Jack saw at the far end of the parade 20 or 30 white tented wagons. He was walking towards them when he was stopped by a sound of clapping. To his right, he saw a wooden platform on which a small man in a garish checkered suit was doing a balancing act. He held a walking stick on his forehead and was balancing a plate on its other end. On one side of the platform was the sign Mitchum's Marvelous Magic Show, and underneath, in smaller lettering, Amazing and Mysterious Feats of the Past and Present. The man finished his act, placed a straw boater on his head, and said in a gravelly showman's voice, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, what you have all been waiting for, the sweetest voice in 3 continents, the Saray Nightingale." He gave 2 loud introductory chords on a battered upright piano, and a young woman came onto the platform. Jack had little ear for music and began to turn away. Then she started to sing. There was such an infallible sweetness in her voice that it touched something in him he had not known existed. He felt a great sadness come over him, yet he had nothing to be sad about. He pushed forward. She was about his own age and beautiful in a way he had never seen before. Her skin, in the light of the torches that blazed at the corners of the platform, was alabaster. At the end of each song, the crowd shouted and stamped their approval, but Jack stood silent, transfixed by her voice and her looks. He was still standing there when she finished and left the platform to the barker. After beauty comes the beast, he shouted. A big hand now for the champion of Singapore and Macau, bare knuckle champion of Adelaide, famous in Europe and the Americas, world renowned with or without the mufflers. Ladies and gentlemen, the Batavian giant. The new arrival was one of the biggest men Jack had seen. He was dressed only in a pair of Turkish trousers that were caught in at the ankles. His body was covered in tattoos. Snakes wound from his chest to his back and down his arms. Fish swam on his stomach, and even his sides were decorated. His head was shaven and, like his body, had been oiled. He had a broad flat face that gazed contemptuously at the crowd. Stay 3 rounds with the giant and it's 25 quid for you. Knock him down and it's 50. Now, who's first? A challenger was already in the corner. a young farmer whose body, except for his neck, hands, and forearms, was as white as snow. He had little knowledge of boxing, and the Batavian giant sent him to his knees inside a half a minute. The next man was a digger, by the look of his clothes, and he lasted into the second round before being knocked into the crowd. There was something coldly savage about the way the tattooed man dealt with them, and Jack was reminded of a cat playing with a wounded bird. He had done his share of fighting as a sailor, and inspecting the giant, he realized that he was overweight as well as being older than he looked. If Jack could stay 3 rounds, he would have enough money for a ticket on the coach. If he could knock the giant down, he would have money over. The third challenger was being picked off the floor by the barker when Jack pushed forward. "I'll have a go," he shouted. The barker looked down at him and shook his head. "3 is the limit. Give us a chance." "No more than 3. What about tomorrow then?" "We won't be here tomorrow." Jack saw his chance slipping away. He looked up at the glistening face of the Batavian giant. "You afraid of me?" The crowd liked that, but the giant was not to be outfaced. "We meet one day," he said in a heavy accent. "Then we see who is afraid." He draped his shoulders with a green silk dressing gown and jumped down from the platform. Alongside the ring were the closed wagons of the troop. They reminded Jack of gypsy caravans, and the tattooed man pushed open the door of one and went in. Jack caught a glimpse of the girl who had sung so beautifully before the door closed again. "You should have had your chance," a voice said, and Jack turned to see David Cade. He was holding his hat in his hand. His hair was short and fitted closely to his skull like a cap. He gave an impression of composure and neatness, and Jack suspected that under his dark suit there was a sinew strength. "I saw what happened at the coach office," he continued. "I could lend you a tenner if that would help." Jack opened his mouth to say he didn't want his money, but the Jew seemed a decent enough person. So, instead, he said, "It's all right, thanks. I can manage." It took him some time to find Franz Dalport, who was standing at the rear of his wagon smoking a meerschaum pipe. A small fire burned nearby, and on it stood a coffee pot. He looked at Jack and smiled. "I told you it was costly," Franz said. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning, early. You can sleep there." He indicated the area under the wagon where his own mattress was already laid. The wagon suddenly shook, and the tent flap was pulled to one side. A girl's head emerged. "Father, aren't you going to offer him a cup of coffee?" Franz introduced Marie. She clambered down from the wagon, and Jack saw a girl of about 16 with raven black hair, black eyes, and a smooth olive skin. There was almost a gypsy look about her. "Won't you be seated?" she said, indicating a bale of hay as though it was a grand, silk-covered chair. "Do you take milk? Sugar?" Her eyes sparkled, and Jack saw her father smile behind his hand. Were they laughing at him? He took the mug of coffee, feeling clumsy and ill at ease. "What's the news from London?" she asked. "What news?" Jack said in a surly voice. "Pay no attention to her, Mr. Farson." Franz Laporte was smiling again. "It's the Cape Town school she's been to, Miss Menzies. It is pronounced Minges. Miss Harriet Menzies Academy for Young Ladies. You will have heard of it, Mr. Farson. It is very well known." Abruptly, she got to her feet and clambered back into the tented wagon. Again her face appeared through the flaps. "Good night, Mr. Farson. I hope you do not snore. No, no, I don't. Oyo, sinkatergo, oyo, sinkatergo, oyo, sinkatergo, oyo, sinkatergo. Ah, oyo, macaroni. Mm. Franz Talbot employed two Hottentot servants to look after the oxen, and to gather firewood and make the cooking fires. Jack's main function was to help Talbot with the wagon itself, to manhandle it up slopes where the bullocks needed assistance, to act as an anchor on the down gradients when it might have run away with the oxen, to float it across streams, or to go ahead and see that the fords were not too deep and that there was a good stony bottom, for the pump was heavy and the wagon wheels bit into the surface of the ground more deeply than usual. The pump itself was in several parts, each boxed and labeled "The Invincible G.A. Gwyn, Hammersmith, London." Is it Gwen? Oh, G.A. Gwyn, Hammersmith, London, and had come out in the cargo of the SS Northbrook. Talbot would check the boxes 2 or 3 times a day, and once he patted one of them and said, "Where we come from, water is worth more than diamonds." "It's a present from my mother," Maria told Jack. "Mr. Farson will think we're strange people giving presents like this," her father said. "But she wants to grow crops, and the land is too dry." If we can pump water up and irrigate the fields, then we can grow many things, especially maize. It's a surprise, Marie said. Don't you think it's a lovely surprise? Perhaps we'll keep it for her Christmas stocking. Her eyes flashed at him, and he saw Franz Dalport's slow smile. Again, he wondered if he was the butt of some joke he did not understand. At first, he minded his own business. Around the evening fire, he was silent, recognizing his own roughness when he was in their company, especially Marie's. Even a father who had lived a life far removed from civilizing influences seemed polished by comparison with himself. Marie treated him much as she treated Franz, as though they were overgrown boys who had to be watched and bullied so she could have her way. He had no idea at first how to react to such behavior. His only experience of woman had been his mother, his half sister, and the brothel woman he had used in a score of ports around the world. Marie was something new. Slowly, his irritation changed to a kind of heavy handed banter, and he found himself enjoying the unfamiliar relationship. They would often find themselves in each other's company as they walked alongside the wagon through the heat of the day, and he learned from her about the farm in the desert of the Northwest, and about how her mother and father had met and built their house and started keeping sheep and goats. When she spoke of it, her face would sometimes tighten and her mouth would turn down. We had the impression that she did not want to go back, and once when he asked her, she said angrily, I'm only a girl. I have to do what I'm told. He discovered she had a passion for England, and she tried to use him like an encyclopedia. Miss Harriet Menzies, it seemed, had instilled into her girls a fascination for the British social scene, and Marie would press him about such beings as dukes and earls and viscounts. Had he met any? Did he know a real lord? Did the aristocrats eat off gold plate? More than once, she professed an ambition to spend Christmas in a grand country house with thick snow all around. Jack, she said, might come with her, if he liked. Her father, listening, wondered out loud what nonsense Miss Harriet had stuffed into her head. Often, when Jack was alone with Franz, he would ask about the diggings. He learned that diamonds had originally been found on the Val River, but then the big discoveries had been made at what were called the dry diggings, later renamed New Rush, because everyone had rushed there, and later stole Kimberley after a British politician. A town by that name had already grown up. Have you ever worked on the diggings? He asked. Talbot shook his head in distaste. I keep as far away as I can. Without the diggings, we would have no money, Marie said waspishly. Wasp, wasp, waspishly. Said waspishly. Yeah, we were better off without it, Franz said. You would never have been able to send me to school. Maybe that would have been better too. Tell us about Kimberley, she said. Tell us about the shops and the music halls. She turned to Jack. Some people say it's the most exciting place in Africa. The journey was a slow one, taken at the pace of the oxen, and it was a good day when they managed 10 or 12 miles. But it was a journey on which Marie, Franz, and Jack came to know each other well, and it did not take long for Jack to realize that there was another side to Marie. Superficially, she was a vital, energetic girl with an ebullient that was very attractive. But there was a darker area. Sometimes, for no apparent reason, or at least none that he could define, she would become morose, withdrawn, and angry. Her rages came out of the blue, violent and irrational. She seemed to reserve the worst side of her nature for the Hottentot servants, and it only took a minor miscalculation on their part to bring down her wrath on their heads. During the journey, some of Jack's rough edges were smoothed away, and he began to change. Instead of having to deal with a man whose tight lipped and morose presence made the evenings difficult to endure, the Dalports found him becoming more human, more relaxed. And with this change in attitude, they felt they could ask him about himself. At first, he parried their questions. He was unused to revealing himself, and in the folk- forecastles, a man's past was never volunteered and never inquired into. But when he saw the puzzled looks that greeted his circumlo- circumloc- circumlocutions, 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 he knew he had he knew he would have to say something, however little. He told them just as much as would satisfy them. Circumlocutions, circumlocutions, circumlocutions. The truth was that Jack Farson was the son of a whore and a Norwegian seaman. No one knew much about his father. Down at the East India Docks and the Port of London, they remembered him as a big man with a shock of red hair and fists the size of hands. He was lost at sea when black ice struck his ship off the Faroes. More was known about Jack's mother. Her name was Emma Cook. She was the daughter of a curate in Gloucestershire and was educated at home by her mother. Her brother entered the church and she became governess to two girls in a wealthy family in Salisbury. She did then what many young governesses have done. She fell in love with her charge's brother, Herbert, who was 24. He was the first young man with whom she had been in close contact. She became his mistress on the understanding that they would marry. But after taking her on a tour of the continent, he married someone else. She took up with a cavalry officer who, when he was tired of her, passed her on to a colleague who handed her on to a sergeant, by whom she had a daughter named Mary, until finally she was anyone's woman. She met her Norwegian sailor in the Earl of Effingham, a theatre in the Whitechapel Road, and took him back to her lodgings in Bluegate Fields. They liked each other. Whenever he was in London, she would keep herself for him. Of this union, John was born and took his father's name of Farson. No one in Bluegate Fields ever used his mother's real name. She was called China Emma because someone once said she looked like a China doll. They moved from Bluegate Fields to rooms in Dean Street near the West End. Jack was 12 when his father was killed. At that time, China Emma was in her late 30s and was taken over by a bully called Truman Rutter. She turned her tricks in Perkins Rents, a warren of rooms in Westminster, but she kept her rooms in Dean Street. This was the family home, and she wanted it separate from her business. It was this vestigial remnant of respectability that cost her her life, for she kept back money from Rada to pay the rent and save for her children. At first, she hated about the apartment, but when Rada became suspicious, she began to de- she began to deposit it with a moneylender in the New Cut in Lambeth, using Jack and his half-sister Mary as go-betweens. One day, when Jack was 14 and Marie 2 years older, they were taking money and one or two items of which China Emma had relieved her clients: a watch, a silk handkerchief, and a silver cigar cutter. When Jack noticed Rutter following them on the opposite side of Regent Street, it was coming on the evening of a bitterly cold winter's day, and there was already fog in the streets, heavy with the acrid smell of smoke from 100,000 coal fires. The gas lamps were lit, and the West End began to gather pace for the evening's entertainment. Jack saw Rutter's reflection in a shop window and paused. "Stop gawking," Mary said. "We have things to do." She was a pretty girl with the same soft coloring as their mother. "It's Rutter. He's followed us." "Well, you know what to do." They had talked this possibility over with China Emma and had a plan ready. They walked on. Rutter, on the opposite side, kept station with them, and all Jack could see in the evening crowd was a figure wrapped in an ulster and a scarf, with a tall hat, battered and dented, on his head. Jack was frightened of him. Recently Rutter had caught him alone and said, "Come on now, Jack. You and me's old friends. Where's she hid it then? Where's the rest of the money? One of his women had smashed his nose and he had a permanent drip. There ain't no rest of it. That's of the truth, Jack. You know what I can do. That had been 2 weeks ago, and Jack knew it would not be the end of the matter. He had warned his mother, but she was so far gone on a mixture of gin and laudanum called Mother's Blessing that she hardly paid heed. They crossed Shaftesbury Avenue, dodging past horses' heads, sliding in the dung. Then Mary said, "Now!" and she went one way and Jack the other, both losing themselves in the evening crowd before Rutter knew what was happening. After crisscrossing a dozen alleys and going back on his own tracks until he was certain that Rutter was not following him, Jack continued his journey to Lambeth. At 7 o'clock at night, under fog-hallowed lamps, the new cut was at its busiest. It was a market of sorts, kept free of horse-drawn traffic. The gin shops were roaring, the market bustling. The place was full of working people out for an hour or two. On each side were stalls selling meat, fish, fruit, and over everything was the harsh smell of roasting chestnuts. Mary was waiting for him in a doorway opposite a tailor's shop. They went up the stairs and she knocked at the door at the top. A voice, curiously light and high like a child's, said, "Who is it?" "It's Mary, Mr. Bucks." "Mary who?" "Mary, from Dean Street." It was always the same. Jack heard a step on the far side of the door, the sound of a bolt being drawn, then the turning of a key in the lock, and he smelled the familiar smell of incense. The room was hot from a coal stove in one corner. There was a deal of brassware and bamboo tables. It was said that Mr. Burks had been a clerk in a Malayan go down when he was a young man, and a pair of long jaw sticks burning in a tall Chinese vase. Mr. Burks was short. He looked like an elderly baby with chubby hands and rolls of flesh under his chin. He wore an old silk dressing gown and a Turkish smoking cap of blue velvet decorated with a tassel of gold thread. His face was pink and round, and he had no eyebrows. "Come in, my dears." Jack placed the watch, the silk handkerchief, and the silver cigar cutter on the red leather desk top in front of him. Mr. Burks moved the objects about for a moment with his small, chubby fingers and said, £4 the lot. "Why, the watch is worth that alone," Mary said. "Look." A fat finger went out and pointed to the inscription on the back. "Can't do good business with inscriptions. The peelers have been sniffing about already." "All right," Mary said. "Ma'am says you to have this." She pulled out a purse and counted out a handful of florins. Mr. Burks thumbed through the pages of his small book, added a new set of numbers to the column of figures, drew a line underneath, and wrote in the total, £22, 17 and sixpence a penny. He said. It seemed an immense sum to Jack. The rooms in Dean Street were dark and cold and empty when they got back. They ate slices of bread and dripping, then crawled into the bed they shared. Jack was shaken awake by Mary in the small hours of the following morning. "Ma'am's not home," she said. He tried to clear the sleep from his brain. She was always home by 9 or 10, for she worked mostly by day, picking up customers in the streets and taking them to her room. She tried to keep the evenings for her children. "What do you think?" he said, but the same thought was in both their minds. "We'd best go to Perkins' Rents." "Do you think he—" "I don't know, do I? But just in case, we'd best go and tell her he was following us." It was freezing cold and nearly 5 in the morning, and the first carts were already rumbling into the metropolis with a day's supply of vegetables. Perkins Rents loomed against the night sky, a large building complete in itself. Arched passageways led into a central courtyard around which the 3 floors were built. They climbed the stairs to the cheapest rooms under the leads. Halfway up, a woman stepped out of the shadows. Jack knew her as Beauty, a friend of his mother's. Her dyed hair hung to her shoulders. "You had best not go up," she said. "They're arguing something awful." But Mary pushed past. "Come on, Jack." Then Jack heard shouting, the high-pitched voice of a woman and the roar of a man. There was a smashing of glass and an oath. Then a moment of silence and a scream that was cut short. They ran up the, they ran up the stairs and threw open the door. The first thing he saw was the blood. It came from his mother's head. She was sprawled across the bed and her dress was soaking in blood. She had been cut about the face and neck, but most of it was coming from her skull. On the far side of the room, Mary was struggling with Rutter, clinging onto his right hand in which he held an iron bar. Beyond them burned the coal fire, and in front of it was a poker. Jack grabbed it and with all his strength hit Rutter on the left knee. He gave a great cry of pain and let Mary go. She fell backwards as Jack struck again. This time Rutter went down. Jack raised the poker and hit him on the back of the neck. There was the sound of his stick breaking and Rutter's limbs began to twitch. The room was lit by an orange glare. Mary's dress was alight. Jack beat at the flames with his hands and finally grabbed a blanket and covered her in it. She stood with smoke tendrils rising from her body, whimpering in agony. "It's all right," Jack said. "It's all right." He led her to the stairs. She walked like an automaton, and for the first time he smelled the odor of burnt flesh. Beauty stood in the doorway and watched. "You'd best get to the hospital," she said. He took her to Westminster Hospital, just around the corner, the place reeked of suppuration and decay. They drugged her with laudanum, washed her with a solution of carbolic acid that covered the burns with grease-soaked cotton. They let him sit with her in the ward. 2 hours later, she died. When he came out into the corridor, Beauty was there. "The pillars are round at Perkins' Rents," she said. "Won't be long before they come looking for you." She took him to Wapping, where he was lodged in a brothel for nearly 2 weeks. Then she found him a place on a Whitby collier sailing for Newcastle. He was not to see London again for many years. The road from Cape Town to the diggings was nearly 600 miles long, a single track that wound up from the coast through the forbidding Hex River Mountains to the semi-desert called the Karoo, which stretched to Kimberley and beyond. After life at sea, Jack did not find the journey too taxing, and he might even have enjoyed the slow metamorphosis which his life was undergoing, had it not been that he chafed to get on. This mode of traveling was too slow. The feeling of being left behind was made worse by the coaches that daily thundered past them carrying their loads of diggers to Kimberley. He would watch angrily, eating the dust as the mule or horse teams galloped past, whips cracking, hoofs pounding. "Can't we go faster?" he said once to Talbot. "We'd kill the bullocks. Don't worry, there are more diamonds in the ground than ever came out. If the Lord wills it, you'll get your share." But Jack was not content, and his feeling of frustration was made worse when one of the iron tire bands came off a wheel, and a new one had to be sweated on. As he and Dapod were working on a coach came crashing along the stony track. Jack looked up and saw that David Cade was one of the passengers. His face was covered by a scarf to keep the dust from his mouth, but the Panama hat was like a beacon. The eyes met for a second, and David half raised his head. Then Jack was left in a cloud of choking dust. Be right back. Be right back. BRB. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Dust was also affecting David Cade as he rode the coach to the diggings. Dust and heat and a blazing sun that hung in the sky like a great burnished disk, its rays beating down on a dry wilderness of low scrub, baked earth, and rocky outcrops. This was the semi-desert, and through it the coach carrying David and 11 other passengers pitched and swayed as the driver, a cape-colored man with a tall ostrich feather in his hat, lashed at the eight-horse team with a long stock whip. It was the fourth day of David's journey, but he had lost count. He, like the other passengers, existed in a private world of pain and discomfort, and all were on the verge of heatstroke. "I've seen people's legs swell up in these coaches," his neighbor, a Mr. Levinson, had said to him on the second day, I've seen people have fits because of the conditions. I've seen people go half mad, and try to jump out. Don't, Father, Levinson's daughter had said. Please, don't go on about it. It's bad enough. I'm just telling this young man, her father had said, pitching and heaving, and trying to hold on as the coach hit a deep hole. I'm just warning him what's in store. That way he can adapt. David's eyes were red and filled with dust. He could feel the dust between his teeth and in his hair. Dust devils spun across plains that glittered balefully in the sun. The coach had been converted from a large Cape bullock wagon and weighed, with luggage, nearly 4 tons. 4 benches were placed across the body, and on each bench sat 3 passengers. They were squashed up tight without room to move. It was impossible to read, impossible to do anything except exist. There was a substantial two-way traffic on the track. Wagons and carts drawn by bullocks, horses, or mules were traveling north or south, and so were men on foot, some with hope in their hearts going north, others destitute, traveling south. The coach stopped for nothing, swerved for nothing. Everything got out of their way as they plunged on through the heat of the day. The sides of the coach were covered by canvas blinds, but some had torn away and the sun beat in directly on the passengers. Levinson and his daughter wore smoked glasses, and David kept his Panama hat pulled down over his eyes so that the glare would not become too great. You want to have smoked glasses, Levinson had said. He was a plump man in his 50s with a bald head and a long traceries of hair combed sideways over it. He wore a dark suit and a fob watch and was very respectable. I've seen people get ophthalmia. Ophthalmia. I don't know. What is that? What is that? Ophthalmia. Ophthalmia. What is that? One man was one man went blind. Please, Father, don't, Miss Levinson said. She was sitting on the far side of her father, and now she leaned forward and smiled at David. He's always saying things like that. It's the truth, Levinson said. So I mustn't tell the truth? Miss Levinson was about 20, plump and ripe, with dark hair taken back into a bun. She wore a long traveling gown and a veil to keep the dust from her face, but occasionally, when the coach stopped, she would lift the veil. She had a broad face with high cheekbones, which reminded David of the Slav faces of his childhood. But even her attractive presence could not ameliorate the misery he felt. What is these words? What is it? I am ameliorate. Where's the ameliorate? He wished now with all his heart that he had not come. The shieldlessness of his cousin's house in North London and the emptiness of his life there suddenly seemed inviolable by comparison. His mind dwelt on streets and shops, taverns, music halls, great buildings, elegant terraces, and grassy parks where people strolled on summer Sundays. Here, there was nothing but rock and scrub, dust and heat. He even thought longingly of Cape Town. Its sticky heat was preferable to this furnace. He thought of the girl singing on the Grand Parade. He had never heard a voice so beautiful. Then other memories. The incident at the docks. Jew boy. Well, he was used to it, though that didn't make it any easier to bear. Many a day he had fought the gangs of boys in London who waylaid Jewish children on their way to and from school, and the big red-haired man with the fists. There was something about him. In spite of his curtness, David felt drawn to him, yet apprehensive of him at the same time. There was a danger there, but also a rock-like quality. He was someone you wanted on your side. It was strange, seeing him on the road mending the wagon wheel. It made David feel slightly less alone, though he wished the man had taken the loan he had offered and that he was sitting in the coach right now. He reached under the seat for his bag and brought out one of a dozen books that lay under his shirts. It was called In Search of Diamonds. He tried to read, but the pages jerked before his eyes. Ever been to Lewisham? Mr. Levinson said. Just through it. I was born and bred there. Levinson from Lewisham. My father was a tailor. He held up his hand and seemed to draw a sign in the air. Bespoke tailoring for gentlemen. Best quality. You know anything about tailoring? No. It's not a bad life. Not a good life, but not a bad life. First, the back goes. Then, the legs. Then, the eyes. You can do well as a tailor, but with 8 children, who can do well? 8 children is 8 children. 8 mouths to feed. 16 feet for shoes. I came out to this country as a young man, like you. I took a job in Mrs. Stutterford's. Do you know them? No? The best. Respectable. Good quality merchandise. I worked there for 10 years. Hubbard Assury. Household goods. Gloves. 10 years. And during that time they found diamonds up in the desert. I said to myself, you're still young. You've still got your strength. I was married. Hilda was only a child. But I said to Mrs. Levinson, now is the time. If we are to make our fortunes, we must go. So we went. And now I no longer work for others. I have my own place, Levinson's. Again the hand came out and drew the sign in the air above them. But this time it seemed in both men's imaginations that it was much larger than the sign of Levinson's bespoke tailoring. Thus was Levinson's Emporium, an altogether more exciting concept. I and Mrs. Levinson own that place. We have a house with a wooden floor. We are able to send Hilda to England on a visit. Do you know how I got all this? Father, Mr. Cade doesn't want hard work, Mr. Cade. I worked like a cuffer. I went round the diggings with a sack on my back selling things. Anything. Candles, shoes, soap, razors, combs, anything. Then I began to sell meat. Me, Levinson, who had never cut up anything before, I bought sheep and I killed them, and I cut them up and sold the meat. Led to here, he indicated his shoulders. For goodness sake, father. Like a cover. Every day and half the night. That's how I started up there. Now, well, now it's different. Levinson's Emporium. Yes, it's different now. To reach the diggings in 10 days from the Cape and to make a profit for the owners, the drivers were changed with almost the same regularity as the horses, and no attention was paid to the passengers' comfort. The coach would stop at a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere at 10 o'clock in the morning, or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it would be luncheon always the same: fried mutton chops and fried eggs. Or it might pull into a small village at 9 o'clock at night, and the passengers would be given their supper and then shown to rooms where they could spend a few hours on a bed before leaving at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, charging through the dark starlit night. Everyone was exhausted and spent much of the time on the coach trying to sleep away the hours. David closed his eyes against the glare and fell into a waking doze. His mind was on coolness, the coolness of shade and water. Harsh cold, the cold of the river Dnieper at Kiev, with the ice floes snarling and growling as they split, and his grandfather holding his hand and walking in the bitter wind. Sometimes such memories would come flashing into his mind, pictures of his grandfather and grandmother, the house and the portal, the smoke and the flames. But if he tried to remember, the pictures faded, faces became elusive. He had been only 8 years old when he had been sent out of Russia to his cousin's home in London, and that was more than 12 years ago. His clearest memories were of Kiev itself, mother city of all the Russias, perched on the high bluffs overlooking the river, with its parks, trees, and churches. Being a Jew and living in the ghetto of the Podol, which was on the low ground of the opposite bank, he always had to look up towards the city. On crisp, sunny autumn days when the sun struck the golden domes of the Lavra, the Byzantine monastery, the light seemed to splinter and the larches were golden. The poplars and the birches were golden. In the cold autumn air, everything was a blaze of golden light. Then his name was David Kaczynski, and he lived in his grandparents' house because his own parents had died of cholera. He had a tutor, a young Englishman named Mr. Hemlow, whom he remembered well, blond with a wispy moustache and a weak chin. He had loved poetry and communicated his love to David, but had known little about mathematics, and even at 8 years old, David had been able to tie him up in a maze of angles, sines, and cosines. His grandfather's house in the Street of the Martyrs gave the impression on the outside of being small and poor, as did all Jewish houses, so that they would draw less attention to themselves. Inside, however, it was richly furnished, for Moshe Kadensh, Kaczynski was a jeweler and a wealthy man. David could remember the wolfskin rugs on the floors, the huge painted porcelain stoves, and the rich wall hangings. At the back of the house was a room which his grandfather called the factory, and here he employed 4 men to cut and polish rough gemstones, and 2 others to make the gold and silver settings. At the front of the house was the office where he did most of his business and spent most of his time. It was an elegant room, furnished in leather and velvet with 2 tall rosewood cabinets in which he kept his jewels. You did not come to Moshe Kaczynski to buy a cheap diamond ring for an acquaintance of the night. You came to buy something special, a brooch, perhaps of diamonds and emeralds, once owned by the Emperor of Abyssinia, a necklace worn by Madame du Barry, a ring said to come from the regalia of the House of Braganza, or else you came to choose a rough stone and have it cut and set to your own desires. There was nothing as vulgar as a counter in this room. No jewels were on display. You made your wishes known, and Moshe Kaczynski went to his cabinets and pulled out drawers lined with black velvet and brought out stones or pieces of jewelry for your delectation. Most of his customers came from the city above the river. David did not often go into this room, but when he did it was with an air of breathless expectation. His grandfather would send for cups of hot chocolate, whisked in the French manner, and David would sit in one of the big leather chairs. His feet not quite touching the floor, sipping at the steaming liquid, while his grandfather would tell him stories about jewels, sometimes going to the cabinets and returning with a diamond, saying, "Look into it, Dushka, deep, deep into the center. What do you see?" David would put his grandfather's lobe to his eye and look deeply into the stone, and the light would splinter into red and yellow and blue and orange and indigo and violet. Sometimes it would burn with the white hot fire of the kiln, sometimes with the blue, searing cold of an ice cave. "What do you see?" "Fire and ice," David said. "You are a good boy." But the times he liked best, the times he was to remember all his life, were those moments when, secure into the big chair, the steam of the chocolate rising before his eyes, his grandfather would tell him stories of the great diamonds which had disappeared over the centuries. The lost diamonds, he called them. The great mogul found in Golconda, Golconda in India, which had been set into the peacock throne of Persia and had disappeared in 1747. The murder of Portugal, smuggled out of Lisbon by a nobleman fleeing for his life. The Sensi, the Quad de Bretagne, the Blue Tavernier. The names alone held romance for David. Then all at once the security was shattered. His grandfather was arrested and taken to prison to await trial on a charge of having sexually assaulted and killed a boy whose body was found in an alley near the rear of the house. No one in the portal believed this. Years later, in the trap house in North London, his cousin, Miss Joseph, had read him his grandmother's letters to her, describing what was happening, but at the time he had been too young to understand. The letters reconstituted memories and brought shape to events, so that later he could not tell whether his memories were real or a mixture of what his cousin told him and what he had experienced himself. One memory was sharply in focus. It was his visit to the gaol to see his grandfather. Although the sun shone and the autumn air was dry, bright, and crisp with frost, the prison seemed to have a different climate. There everything was dark. Warders carried lanterns with them wherever they went. The air was heavy with damp, and there was a smell which David had never smelled before. The mixture of unwashed bodies, sewage, and mold. The walls were wet to the touch, and in the light of the prison officer's lantern he could see patches of growing fungus. These were the dungeons of fairy tales, and he shivered with cold and unhappiness. He wished Mr. Hemlow had been allowed to come in too, but the warder had shaken his head and said, "Only the Baron can visit," he said. He said it mockingly, calling David his lord, his master, but no one was fooled. He was a short man with a twisted back, and he hurried crab-wise down passageways that had been cut into living rock. "Don't lose sight of the lamp, or you will wander here forever," he said with a laugh. David kept close behind him, and at last, in the coldest, dampest, and darkest part of the prison, they came to a small wooden door. Behind it, David could hear someone coughing. The warder undid a chain and unlocked two locks. "You would think we had a tiger in here," he said. He pushed the door, and for the first time in months, David saw his grandfather. He seemed only half the size of the man he remembered. He had shrunk by several inches and was emaciated. He sat at a table on the far side of the cell, which was lit by a single tallow candle. He wore a dirty grey blouse torn under the arms, grey trousers, and peasant's boots on his feet. On the floor was a horsechair mattress, and he had taken the blanket from it and wrapped it around his shoulders. His head was shaved because of lice, and it reminded David of a music they had once found lying in an alleyway in the portal who was within a few hours of death by starvation. The immediate impression was of greyness, grey clothes, grey skin, grey skull, sunken eyes, facial bones jutting out of the skin. The nose, which had seemed to fit Moshe Kaczynski's large, fleshy face, was now almost a caricature of a Jewish nose, big hooked, high bridged, out of all proportion to the chin features. David, he said, is it really you? Yes, grandfather. You can go in, the warder said. The smell in the cell was very bad, and much of it emanated from the bucket in the corner, which was all the prisoner had for his bodily functions. The old man rose shakily to his feet and held out his hands. David moved slowly towards him. He knew he was supposed to love this old man, but everything was unfamiliar and frightening. He could not relate his memories to the cell, to the strange, bent, emaciated figure. Moshe Kaczynski took his grandson's hands in his and brought them to his lips. You have grown up, he said. He coughed, then turned to the warder. If it pleases your honor, may we have more light? David was startled. Was this his grandfather? Factory owner, wealthy jeweler, householder, master of servants. Your honor. It will cost you, the warder said. I know. The warder placed a second candle on the table and lit it. The door clanged shut behind him. A grill opened and his face reappeared. The baron has 1 hour. That was the agreement. The extra light penetrated to the shadowy corners of the cell, and David saw that more fungus grew there. It was bitterly cold. His grandfather had another coughing spell. The light also brought out the graffiti on the walls, and David noticed a drawing that looked fresher than the rest. It was of the menorah. The eight-branched candlestick, which was always lit on Friday nights when the family celebrated the Sabbath. He realized that his grandfather must have scratched it on the rock. Sit, the old man said. Sit on the chair. I wish to walk. Unless I walk each day, I cannot get up off the floor. He began to shuffle up and down the small cell. For some minutes there was silence, and then he said, How is your grandmother? She sends her love. She says she's well. Good. Today I go for the verdict. When they have executed me... No, don't look startled. Prepare for it. I have. Your grandmother has. You must too. When I am gone, she will have no one. Then you are the head of the house. You must look after her. You must be me. He broke off and began to cough again. It's the damp. It attacks one's ear. He tapped his chest. But why, grandfather? Why? Why are you here? Why are they going to execute you? Your grandmother never told you. She said you wished to speak to me about it. He drew the blanket more tightly around his shoulders and shuffled backwards and forwards across the bare stone floor. David could feel the cold creep up his legs even though he was wearing fur-lined boots. And the servants? Marcia? Have they not spoken? They said a boy had been found behind the house, that he had been murdered. They said that's why the police had taken you. That is true. But you didn't kill him. The old man touched him on the shoulder, and this time he did not mind the contact so much. No, Dashka, of course not. Well, why then? Angus spurted, and he felt tears come to his eyes. Phrasing it as carefully as he could, with little emotion in his tone, Moshe Kaczynski explained how the Kiev police had begun searching for a tramp who had been seen in the area in the previous day. Then, within 48 hours, an article had appeared in a Moscow newspaper alleging that the Jews of the Podol had murdered the boy. The old man had tried to explain blood libel, the allegation of the centuries that Jews killed young children to use their blood at the Passover. But David had begun to cry and had held his hands to his ears, and a little later the water had come to fetch him. The other memories of that day were blurred. Some moments stood out, like the arrival that afternoon of his grandfather. After a trial lasting nearly a year, the old man had been found not guilty. He was carried home from the courthouse in triumph. The alleys were choked with Jews, all cheering and shouting. It was the greatest day in many of their lives. A Jew found not guilty by a jury of peasants. It was towards evening that the pogrom began. It had started earlier with an attack on one of the two synagogues in Kiev and had then moved to the Podol. Many of the Jews there had recently come from other parts of the Pale of Settlement, the enormous strip of territory stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea in which all Russian Jews were confined and had no residence permits for Kiev. They were hunted down by police, and those who were not killed ended up in gaol. Events happened so quickly after that in David's memory they overlapped and became a jumbled mess. He remembered the money belt being strapped around his waist. He remembered the servants crying. He remembered running with Mr. Hemlow through the alleys filled with flames and smoke. He remembered being taken to a house where he had lived in a room not much bigger than a cupboard for what seemed like weeks, but which in reality could not have been more than a few days, while passage on a barge was found for Mr. Hemlow and himself. Then the long, long journey to England, by barge, coach, train, and finally by ship from Flushing, which ended in the Prim House in Highbury. The desert country began to change, white plains giving way to a broken landscape of rocky outcrops. Hills collided, making a jumble of ravines and kloofs, with great dark red rocks piled one on top of another, radiating heat they could feel in the coach as it wound in and out between them. Just when the passengers were starting to feel desperate, the horses turned off the road, wound through a valley for a mile or two, and pulled up at a lonely house. They ate their unvarying meal of mutton and eggs at small tables in the main room. The house was a derelict farm, which had been bought by the transport company as a way station. A man and a woman lived there to prepare meals. Rooms in the back contained mattresses on which travelers could stretch out for a few hours. "What do you know of diamonds, I ask you?" Mr. Levinson said. "I beg your pardon?" "Diamonds. You know nothing." "I hope to learn." He hopes to learn. "You've seen these men walking the road. They hoped to learn too. They spent all their money, and so they didn't learn. Before we left the Cape, I said to Mrs. Levinson, 'What do we know about digging for diamonds?' 'Nothing. But people who dig must eat. They must wear clothes. They must keep warm.' Do you know what she said?" "Yes, father, we can guess what she said," Hilda said. "Is this how you speak to your father?" He turned to David. "Have you ever thought of the mercantile life?" He used the word grandly, giving the impression of a merchant venturer, which was perhaps how he saw himself. David shook his head. "Well, you should think. Use your head, not your hands." He cut a fried egg in half and filled his mouth. "Listen, I could do with a good boy like you, one with brains, a head on his shoulders, someone who can deal with figures." David was aware of a sudden look of interest on Miss Levinson's face. "Do you know figures?" Levinson said. "I worked in a bank." "There you are, then. It's fate." David smiled and shook his head. Later, Mr. Levinson smoked a cigar on the stoop, and David and Mrs. Levinson strolled in the cool of the evening. "Father means it about the shop," she said. "Good people are difficult to find." "It's kind of him." "It's not kind," she said with a touch of irritability. "It's practical, but you don't want to. You want to dig in the ground and trust to luck." "I've come a long way," he said. How could he make her understand how he had felt in London, in the grim, prim house, where there had been no love and no warmth? "You said you came from Russia," she said, mistaking his meaning. Um, that was a long time ago." "You don't sound Russian. I mean, you have no accent." "I had an English tutor. Anyway, I was only 8 when I left." "A tutor? Your family must have been rich." "Yes." "What happened to them?" He did not want to talk about the pogrom. Instead, he said, "They are old. They died." "And then you went to London?" "To my grandmother's cousin." If there was anything that might have put him off the mercantile life, as Levinson phrased it was his cousin's constant reiteration of the words "the family business" or "the family firm." This, it turned out, had been a tobacconist's in the High Street, Islington, which had been sold when her father died, and on the small proceeds of which she lived a life of gentility steeped in poverty. David had grown up in an ambience of prudishness, primness, and snobbery. He had gone to the local board school, but had easily outstripped his classmates and had taken a scholarship to Highbury Grammar, where he had changed his name to Cade. Too outlandish, his headmaster had said of Cade Shinsky. Too much of a mouthful. Anyway, it's not English. He found out later that there were several boys of Polish and Russian immigrant parents who had also changed their names or shortened them. At first, his English, though fluent, was heavily accented, and thus, with his size, which was on the small side, made him the target of casual bullying. Because he was much on his own, he read a lot and began to live in his imagination. When he was 14, he started to grow again. He never became tall, but his shoulders and arms strengthened, and he found he could fight as well as, and in many cases better than, the boys who had dominated him for years. Soon, he was left alone. You should go on to the university, his headmaster said more than once after he had written an unusually good essay, but there was not the money. But there was not the money. Instead, one of Miss Joseph's acquaintances, an old man who had known her father from his tobacconist's days, found David a job in a bank. This was much worse than school. Each day he took the omnibus into the city, worked at his ledgers, and then caught another omnibus home. He paid his cousin for his board and lodging, and what little money he had left over he saved to buy books or sometimes spent recklessly on boat trip to Hampton Court. It was in the bank that he began to come across names like Detroit's Pen, Bultfontein, De Beers, and New Rush, names which involved large financial transactions based on diamonds. In the grey London winters, these names had a romantic ring. He started buying books about the diamond fields of southern Africa. He read everything he could find, which was not much. Some of them told the personal experiences of diggers who had made their fortunes. He became obsessed by diamonds. He spent hours at diamond exhibitions, haunted the windows of jewelers' shops, and pored over newspaper reports of fluctuations in the diamond market. But there was never the slightest chance of making the journey to the diggings, for he had come to learn, from the same old gentleman who had found him his position, that his cousin was practically penniless. The house was all she owned, and that was mortgaged. She had slowly gone through her capital, much of it spent on his upbringing, and now she depended upon what David could earn. He felt trapped. He could see no way ahead except year upon year of his high stool and his ledgers. And then one day he had come back from the bank and had opened the front door and seen Miss Joseph lying in a huddle at the bottom of the stairs. She was dead. The doctor said she must have had a seizure at the top and fallen to her death. The house was sold. Her debts were paid. And there was left over the sum of £160. He had bought a ticket on the first ship sailing to Cape Town, had outfitted himself as best he could, had packed his favorite books, and had left London, as he thought, for good. Of that money he kept some on him for day-to-day expenses, but the bulk of his capital, £80, was sewn into the lining of his travelling bag. Now, as he said good night to Miss Levinson, for they were to rest for several hours before resuming the journey, he went to the coach and checked that the money was still there. It was. He took out a box of paper and replaced the bag under his seat. Bodily functions and the schedule of the coach did not often coincide, and the watchword, as far as he was concerned, was do it while you can. Whenever you whenever he could, he chose the wide open vault and the privacy of darkness. He walked around the house and struck off into the low hills. It was easy to see his way, for the stars were bright and the desert was bathed in silvery light. He walked on until he had put a decent distance between himself and the house. Then he lowered his trousers and squatted. When he had finished and adjusted his dress, he started back. But after a few steps, he stopped. The landscape looked unfamiliar from the new angle. Was this the right way? He started off again. This time he walked for several hundred yards. Again he stopped. He felt sure this was not the right direction. But which way was right? He thought of all the books he had read. What would the old Africa hands have done in these circumstances? Followed their tracks back to the farmhouse. But he could not make out his tracks. Take a direction from the moon. But there was no moon. The Southern Cross then. But he had not looked up to find the constellation of stars when he had set out, so it could not give him a bearing now. He decided to climb a low hill to see if he could see a light from the way station. He could see nothing, and when he came down, stumbling and bruising himself, he knew he was well and truly lost. He began to hurry, first one way, then another. Sometimes he ran, so great was his panic. Dawn, a grey dawn that gave way to lavender and gold, found him stumbling about like a drunken man, clothes torn, skin scratched from a dozen falls, and his mouth dry as tinder from lack of water. On and on he went, as the sun began to heat the air. About mid-morning, when what little strength he had left was running out, he came across the track from Cape Town to the diggings. It stretched away on either side of him like a scar on the surface of the moon. He lay down in the shade of a bush and lost consciousness. He woke late in the afternoon and found two diggers staring down at him. He tried to say something, but his lips were cracked and his tongue swollen. "Don't try to speak, son," the older man said. He had a water bag and moistened a handkerchief and placed it in David's mouth. He sucked it. The man wet it again and returned it. After a few minutes, David was able to take the water in small amounts, and in an hour he was talking. The older man's name was Joseph Malone, and David put his age at about 61 or 2. He was scrawny and lined. His blue eyes were faded by tropical suns, and he appeared to be generally weather-beaten, like an old desert shack. When he spoke, the loose skin on his neck quivered, and his prominent Adam's apple bobbled up and down. Dusk was falling. They made David comfortable and then searched for firewood. He saw a strange contraption, a large two-seater tricycle, at the side of the track. When they returned, he asked about it. "Ah, Daniel made it," Malone said with pride. "He can do anything with his hands. Show him the sail, Dan." Daniel Halkett was in his early 20s, a short, quiet man. At first he appeared shy and self-effacing, but later David was to discover that he only spoke when he had something to say. "Go on, Daniel. Show him." Halkett went to the tricycle and raised a canvas sail on a simple wooden frame. "We invented it," Malone said. "Calls it a sail cycle. When the wind's behind us, guess you could say we were sailing cycling." He chuckled and his Adam's apple bobbed. They sat around the fire, shared what little food they had, and talked. Malone was an American whose life had been spent in the search for valuable metals and stones. He had prospected for gold in California, for silver in Colorado, and for diamonds in Brazil. Now, with Daniel as his companion, he was on his way once more to where the acting was. Halkett's background emerged slowly over the next few days. He was the son of a yeoman farmer in Hampshire and had left the farm to try his luck. He and Malone had met in another digger special, this time sailing from Liverpool. On board, Dan had developed scarlet fever, and Malone, whose life had forced him to learn the basics of doctoring, had nursed him through it in a specially isolated cabin. He had then waited in Cape Town while Daniel's strength returned, spending his own money on a good boarding house. Penniless, they had set out to walk to the diggings and had now reached almost halfway. Easy to get lost in these parts, Malone said. Same with most scrub deserts. This place reminds me of the Mojave. Got lost there myself once. You're lucky to be alive. They had been on the road for more than 2 months, and David was to find out the following day how they existed without money. Since he was still weak, they gave him the rear seat on the tricycle and took it in turns to pedal. There were few farms in this dry part of the country, but they existed at each farmhouse. Halkett and Malone would offer to do jobs for food and lodging. Halkett, as Malone had said, was a genius with his hands. Nothing seemed beyond him. David saw him take the innards out of a fob watch and put it right. He saw him with his short, stubby fingers mend a delicate ivory fan so you would never know it had been broken. He reset a cameo brooch, made a picture frame, turned pots, soldered pans, and put a shaft on a windmill that had broken down. While he worked, Joe Malone set up an easel and made quick but accurate sketches of the members of the family in charcoal, the old fingers flying back and forth as he sought for a likeness. The children would crowd round as he drew their mothers and fathers, stolid, serious-minded farming folk whose lives were hard and whose expressions were grim. And they would laugh. David realized that for the children this was an unexpected break in their dreary lives. Normal children, as he knew them, would have been at school, but here there were no schools. The farmers told him that education was their biggest problem. He was struck by the simple brilliance of the Malone-Halkett partnership. They were utilizing their skills in the only way they knew how, and not only were they made welcome, in many cases, they were begged to stay on. They were together for nearly 3 weeks before they reached the village of Victoria, the halfway stage on the road to the diggings. During that time, he had revised his opinion of his two companions. In his quiet way, it was Halkett who appeared to be the older and wiser of the two. Malone was a dreamer. The gold was always over the next hill, the diamonds round the next corner. Halkett would listen to his tales of prospecting in California and Brazil, and David would wonder how often he had heard the same stories, for even he was now hearing some for the second time, yet Halkett never gave any indication of boredom. One curious incident gave him a clue to their relationship. A farmer offered them each a glass of his homemade peach brandy after their evening meal. Malone had stretched out his hand to take it when he must have caught a look in Halkett's eyes, for he dropped his hand and, embarrassed, said, "Thanks, I never use it." They reached the village of Victoria in mid-afternoon. It was an oasis comprising a single short street on which stood the Lord Somerset Hotel, a post office, a bank. Both the latter were one-roomed affairs. A boarding house with a tin roof, a general store, and a few private houses. The street was lined with pepper trees, and a stream marked by wild willows and mimosa wound its way past the village. David first saw Victoria from a low hill 2 miles away, and his impression was of a square of green in a huge brown plain. Instead of spending the night there, Halkett and Malone decided to push on. "We don't trust villagers," Halkett said in a surprising rush of words. They asked David to continue with them, but when he refused, they did not press him, for it was clear that that three men were not as efficient as two. He stood in the dusty street and watched them cycle precariously out onto the hot, dusty plain and felt a pang of loneliness he had not felt for a long time. He went to the Lord Somerset Hotel. It was painted white and was turreted, a cross between an English castle and a desert fort, with the Union Jack flying at the masthead. The place was full of diggers going to Kimberley or coming south. Meals were served around the clock, for coaches were apt to arrive at any time of the day or night. The hotel owner was a thin-faced, sweaty Englishman who spent most of his time shouting at the servants in the boiling kitchen. He was also the agent for the coach line. "You're breaking my heart, friend," he said when he heard David's story. "But if you ain't got money, and you ain't got a ticket, then that's all there is to it." David stood in the street and counted his money. He had less than £4. He went into the general store and bought himself a cheap blanket, a dozen lined exercise books, 6 lead pencils, a Billiken coffee, and 2 simple reading books. He asked for and was given a sack to carry his things in. Now he had less than 10 shillings. He was thirsty and he crossed to the bar of the hotel, which was beginning to fill up at this time in the afternoon. He poured himself a glass of beer and took it to a table in a quiet corner at which a man was sitting. "Do you mind?" David said, indicating a vacant chair. "Please yourself." The man looked up and David found himself staring at Jack Farson. They were equally surprised. "I thought you'd be at the diggings by now," Jack said. "I thought so too." David saw a big, raw-boned man who had taken on a slight sunburn and had also put on weight since he had last seen him. Jack saw a man travel-stained and weary. His clothing was dusty and torn, and who did not look the same person who had shuffled £5 notes across the ticket counter in Cape Town. David noticed that Jack's glass was empty, and he put his own down in front of him. "I'll get another for myself." They drank the beers, and Jack bought a round, and they each told the other briefly what had happened. Jack said, "How will you get on then, if you ain't got your money?" David pointed to the sack on the floor and described what he had bought and with what idea. "Teach? At the farms? Why not? I had a good education. I worked in a bank. I can read and write and work with numbers. That's all that's needed. It'll take a time, won't it? No longer than the wagon of yours. Let's have another." He bought 2 more beers and brought them back to the table. "Well, that's that," he said, pulling his trouser pocket inside out. "That's what?" "I mean, that's every penny." The beers had gone to his head, and he laughed. Jack laughed too, but in a puzzled way. "You ain't got a penny left? Is that what you mean?" "Not a penny." Jack stared at him in amazement. No one had ever spent the last penny on him. In fact, not many people had ever spent anything on him. What amazed him even more was that this generosity should come from a Jew. They drank up and he said, "What are you going to do? It's dark." "Can't help that," David said, feeling slightly lightheaded. "Can't stop the sun. Um, you better come with me and get some food inside you." He took him to the wagon park on the outskirts of the village and introduced him to Franz Dalport and Marie. It was a friendly supper, and afterwards Dalport showed David his pump. All he could see were wooden boxes, but to the farmer even these had a kind of magic. All the way from Hammersmith in London, he said, patting the wood. They're invincible. That's a name, isn't it? Later they showed him a place to sleep under the wagon. The following morning he was washing at the stream when Jack came up. When are you moving? The sooner the better. You say that the other man, Alcat, you say he did odd jobs. Not odd jobs. He's a genius with his hands. I've seen him take a clock to pieces and put it together, and not one piece was missing. Jack looked down at his own huge hands and flexed his fingers. Mr. Dalport says we've got to lay over here a fortnight to give the oxen a rest. I was thinking. Yes? It came out in a rush. I ain't a genius with my hands, but I learned the sailmaker's craft, and I can mend the canvas tops of wagons. And I was helper to a ship's carpenter, and I can work with wood. And Mr. Talbot says he don't mind as we're over the biggest mountains. And I've got a few quid, just in case. At first, David was not sure what he was talking about. Then it came to him. You want us to join up? Is that it? If it's all right. David could see the sweat on his forehead, brought out by the effort it had cost him to ask. Of course it is. I'll teach them school and you'll mend the wagons. Why, it's the best thing I can think of. Oh, it's taking fucking forever, bro. I just want to get it. 2 months later, they came to the diggings. They were different men by then, toughened to the ways of the country and the desert sun. As they made their way north, they had stopped at farms and villages. At each place, David had given lessons in return for food and lodging, and Jack had spliced ropes and cut new sailcloths and mended wagons. They had slept hard and eaten short, and sometimes they had starved and often been dry as old bones. They had come to expect little and get little. They had grown close in the sense of closeness brought on by hardship. As was natural in two men of much of the same age and ambition, removed in time and space from backgrounds which would have militated against their ever meeting one another, let alone becoming friendly, a bond formed between them. They were very different. David realized that Jack, basically ignorant of anything academic, knew how to work with his hands, and there was also the rock like quality he had early perceived. To Jack, David was a strange creature, someone who could never be taught to splice a rope's end, but who could visit places of the mind about which Jack could only speculate and of which he was in awe. At first, he had been reserved about David. He was, after all, a Jew. But later, as the length of their time together grew without mishap, their trust in each other also grew. But what bound them more tightly than anything else was their passion for diamonds. They talked of little else in their spare time. They went over and over what they would do if they struck lucky. Jack's dreams were of riches, food, drink, and women. But David spoke of the stones themselves, of weight and purity, of blue whites and greens, of stones that were rose cut, or cushion cut, or table cut. They would talk mainly at night in some bare room of a lonely farmhouse. Jack would lie back on his bed, his arms folded behind his head, and often David would think him asleep. And then Jack would say, "Tell me about the big one, the Indian one." And David would lean back against the mud wall in the light of a guttering candle and tell him about the Great Mogul, or the Murder of Portugal, or the Sensi, and the room would dissolve, and again he would be seated in the big leather armchair with the steam rising from the hot chocolate, listening to his grandfather. At these times, he would be overtaken by an ineffable feeling of sadness, of something lost forever. It went on like this sometimes for an hour or more. It seemed that Jack could never get enough of the stories surrounding these great stones. Sometimes David would forget a fact or turn a story around in an unfamiliar way, and Jack would always make him go back and tell it right. He was like a child to whom the shaping of the facts was vital. Once he told Jack about his grandfather's room in Kiev, where the old man had shown him his diamonds and had asked him to describe what he saw. The phrase fire and ice, which had delighted David's grandfather, seemed to delight Jack too, for he said it over and over like an incantation, tasting it. Fire and ice. I like that. Oh boy, just a few more pages. They reached Kimberley on a blustery autumn day with the first hint of a high-felt winter in the breeze, and all they could see was dust. They saw the cloud from 50 miles away, a great brown smudge in the blue sky. As they drew nearer, the dust thickened until it began to settle on them like dirty pollen. They left the road, for it was filled with wagons and traps and Scotch carts, all carrying wood and water, meat and vegetables towards the cloud. They cut straight across the flat desert. Neither spoke, neither knew what to say. Until then, the desert had at least been clean under a blue sky. Now everything, their clothes, the wagons, even the bushes were covered by a patina of dust. Abruptly, they came upon the diggings themselves. At first, they could hardly believe their eyes. Before them lay a gigantic hole cut deep into the earth, in which thousands of people were toiling like ants in a nest. The hole appeared to be about half a mile in diameter. Its bottom was uneven where some had dug deeper than others. It was like a great lunar crater from which stalagmites rose up, some as tall as buildings, with squared off tops on which men, black, white, yellow, brown, all with clothes tied over their mouths and noses to keep out the dust, were working. Sweet Jesus, Jack said. Both men registered the same shock. Nothing David had read had prepared him for the reality. And although Jack had spent hours pumping Dalport for information about the diggings, his imagination had not been vivid enough to create a true picture. It was the size of the thing that shocked them. The hole in the ground was so vast, and the people toiling in it so tiny that it lacked human scale. They walked on, across the parched and dusty desert, to the town of Kimberley itself. The outskirts were unattractive, wooden houses mingled with tents, corrugated iron buildings with mud huts. The place looked as though it had appeared overnight. Once they reached the town proper, things became more familiar. But even here, famous European banks and shipping lines occupied dusty iron sheds. Both were reminded of London, not physically, but there was the same bustle, the same air of mercantile and commercial dealing, of good luck and bad, of money to be made and lost. They walked along the dusty streets and saw every shade of skin color, from the pink white of the Nordic races through the dark cast of the Mediterranean to the yellow of the Chinese and Japanese and Hottentots to the blue black of the tribal African. They heard English and Dutch, German and Swedish, Yiddish and French and Italian, and frequently the nasal twang of America, Australia, and New Zealand. Slowly, the sheer exuberance of the place infected their spirits. As they made their way, as they made their way to the center of the town, a man raced past them holding something in its hand and shouting, "I found one! I found one!" It took them some moments to realize it must be a diamond, and they felt a surge of excitement at the knowledge that what they had heard was true. You could come here and get rich if you were lucky. Then the man was gone, and in its place, coming towards them down another dusty street, was a house. It had wooden walls and a tin roof. Its windows were in place, even its curtains were drawn. It was being carried to a new site by 50 black men whose sweating bodies supported its own posts, the size of railway sleepers. Drunks were being thrown out of bars that were called cozies. Lemonade sellers were shouting their wares from corner stalls. Pianos were tinkling in the brothels. There was the sound of a concertina. Everything was lively. They came to a large square which served as a wagon park and marketplace, and on the far side, like some pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, was a wooden framed building with a large painted sign above the door which said Levison's Emporium. There it is, David said, as though he had never quite believed in it. It took a moment for his eyes to become used to the dim light inside the shop. A white scrubbed pine counter ran along three sides of it, with shelves and drawers behind it. On the floor in the foreground were open bags of potatoes, loose maize, wheat, split peas, brown beans, and coffee beans. Next to them lay coils of rope and wire, boxes of candles and soap, and hanging from the rafters were picks and shovels and sides of bacon and bunches of lanterns all tied together, and mangles and hand mills and 100 other things which he could not make out. On the counter were balls of cloth, ropes of chewing tobacco and huge cheddar cheeses, and on the far side of the shop, racks of woolen shirts, corduroy breeches, boxes of boots, and stacks of hats. There were balls of lace, dresses, and hats imported from Europe, men's shoes from London, and tweed woven in Lancashire. Over everything was a smell that he discovered later was a mixture of strong yellow soap, ground coffee, bacon, and paraffin. For the rest of his life, these smells would remind him of that first day in Kimberley. The shop was empty of customers at that moment. A short, very fat woman sat on a high stool behind a cash register, and farther along the counter, a second woman was bending over a ledger. She looked up as they advanced through the mass of goods on the floor, and David saw that it was Hilda. He stopped a few feet from the counter. "Yes?" she said. "Can I help you?" He did not reply. She stared more closely at his dusty figure, and a look of dawning recognition crept into her eyes, so softly that he almost did not catch it. She said, "It's you!" "Yes, it's me." Instead of putting out her hand to greet him, she turned and fled down the length of the counter to a door at the back. "Father! Father!" she shouted. "Father, it's David! It's Mr. Cade!" They were back in a matter of seconds, Mr. Levinson bustling in ahead of Hilda. "Lost and found!" he cried, taking David's hands in both of his. "The prodigal returns." He turned to the woman at the cash register. "Rachel, it's him." "It's who?" "The bag." "Mr. Cade, Mama." Mrs. Levinson smiled and nodded, her whole face wobbling with the movement. "We thought he was lost," Levinson said, his bald head shining whitely in the gloom. "But here he is, the boy from nowhere." Everyone was talking at once. Mr. Levinson was shouting, Mrs. Levinson and Hilda were laughing. David, a smile on his face, was still shaking hands. Then Jack was introduced, and because it was almost the end of the trading day, the shop was closed, and they went into the living area at the back, which had a wooden floor. They were given glasses of whiskey, and David was called upon to tell what had happened. "You said good night," Mr. Levinson said. "What happened then?" It was not possible to advance the true reason for going out alone in the desert, and so he made up a story about being unable to sleep and needing a walk. When he described how he had become disorientated and had wandered across the desert in the blazing heat until he had collapsed by the side of the track, Mr. Levinson said, "People can die in this heat. Their tongues go black. I've seen—" "Morose, please," Mrs. Levinson said. Then it was their turn, and Hilda and her father broke across each other's sentences and told him how they had searched and how the coach had been held up, how they had sent messages to Victoria, which she had never received, and how they had thought of sending his bag. Yes, the bag was there, the money untouched, and the clothes intact. How they had thought of sending it by one of the southbound coaches, but then had reconsidered and told themselves that since he was making his way north, it would be best to keep it. Although it was not home, although he had never been there before, it was the kind of homecoming that David had always imagined when he had read of such things. The Levinsons were no kin of his, he hardly knew them, yet he felt almost like a son. The room was furnished much as they might have furnished a house in Lewisham, with heavy stuffed furniture and macassars, and mahogany chairs and tables, and a patterned carpet in the Persian style. But birds of Africa kept intruding, like the corrugated iron that formed the walls and roof, and the lizards that scuttled about in the lamplight. David had noticed that while the front of the building had a wooden facade, the sides and back were made of mud bricks lined with corrugated iron. Wood was scarce and came as planks first by boat from Sweden and then by ox wagon from the coast. Mr. Levinson was proud of his wooden floor. There were only 3 like it in the town. But there was a sour note that became more apparent as the evening wore on: the presence of Jack. The more David talked and was the center of attention, the quieter and more sullen Jack became. Mrs. Levinson, who had spent the meal urging them to eat because of the long journey they had just completed, asked him about his own past and background, and he mumbled about London and the sea and left it at that. David realized that though he had spent the last weeks closer to Jack than anyone in his life, he knew little more about him than the few facts he had released. Levinson opened a bottle of port and held up a glass. I said I'd found a young man. Didn't I say that, Hilda? Yes, father. He turned to David. Have you decided? It's still the same, Mr. Levinson. Well, you boys must have your spot. You go off and do your digging. Maybe you'll find a diamond and maybe you won't. But when you become serious, then come to me. And Mr. Farson, well, Milwitsky and Rosenberg are always looking for good people. Hilda lighted them to a room at the back. I must give you a spare candle, she said. David followed her to the larder. As she held out a candle in her holder, she said, I'm so glad you're here, Mr. Cade. You called me David a while ago. She was smiling. The candlelight threw her cheekbones into relief, and she was very pretty at that moment. 2 days later, Jack and David formed their partnership. It did not come easily. They would need money to buy a claim and equipment, and David had £80, which Jack could not match, but David was determined. In spite of Jack's silences and his truculence and anger, a bond had grown up. A bond had grown up between them, forged by hardship. He needed Jack to give him the confidence to do what he wanted to do. So when Jack spoke of getting work and saving up to put money into the partnership, he said impatiently, That's just a waste of time. With my money, we can start now. And the sooner we start, the sooner we'll make a find. Jack sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his large white feet and shook his head. I know you don't like to be beholden to anyone, David said. But it isn't a question of that. We'll get Mr. Levinson to find a lawyer and we'll drop up proper papers. You can borrow the money from me and pay me back from your share of the profits. This will be our working capital. This will be the start. Finally, Jack agreed. The first thing was to find a claim and register it. In the early days, picking a claim had been a matter of joining an organized foot race with a couple of hundred other diggers in a virgin area on the first come, first served principle. Each 30-foot square claim would be marked out with pegs and the digger would go off to register it, hoping that the claim jumpers hadn't already taken the topsoil out by the time he returned. Now things were different. Not far from the center of Kimberley was a large square tent which served as the registration office. Here was displayed lists of abandoned claims which were available for re-registration. There were also lists of claims which were for sale. Diggers interested in buying would record the numbers of a few claims and then go off and inspect them. This is what David and Jack proceeded to do. It was a confusing time, for they did not know exactly what they were looking for. The claims were in and around the big hole, and some were deep, and some not so deep, and some were on the rim, and some were in yellow ground, and some were covered in depths of nearly 20 feet by the topsoil, red gravel, dumped there by neighboring diggers, which would have would, which would have to be removed before the claim could be restarted. They spoke to diggers, they heard stories of good luck and bad luck in about equal quantities. They were offered advice by everyone, a lot of it conflicting. They only had the come on, money to buy one claim, and they knew it had to be the right one. But what was a good claim? What was a bad one? How to begin? They had be- they had been looking for several days when, on a Saturday afternoon, walking back from the registration office, they come across a public auction. They were to know these auctions well, for they were a feature of life on the diggings. Each Saturday morning, J. Rothschild would draw his wagon into the market square and sell anything anyone was offering. In a place where man could become rich in a single instant and go bust almost as quickly, the variety of goods for sale was wide. In the following years, David was to see such diverse offerings as a pure white grand piano, a coat made entirely of ostrich feathers, a set of gold false teeth, a single glaring glass eye, a carriage which was inlaid with mother of pearl and furnished with watered silk upholstery and drawn by four trained zebras, a large male monkey on a perch that masturbated continuously, to the delight of the crowd, and a surgical centerfold with a porcelain foot on which the nails were painted in silver. But mainly, the auctions comprised the effects of diggers who had died from typhoid, cholera, dysen- dysen- dysentery, or one of half a dozen fevers, or who had lost everything. Shovels were bought for a few pence, and so were picks and lanterns and boots and hats. Everything told the story of failure. On this particular Saturday afternoon, they were watching the auctioneer sell off part of a bedroom suite, which must have been brought up from the Cape at great expense, when David felt a tap on the shoulder. He turned round and saw the tall, thin figure and grizzled face of Joseph Malone. By his side was Daniel Halkett. They greeted each other like long lost friends. The two were dressed in clean khaki shirts and breeches, and both were sunburned and thinner than when David had last seen them. He introduced them to Jack and then said to Malone, "You're the very man we've been looking for. How's that?" David told him about their arrival, about the recovery of his money, and how they were looking for a claim. "Let me buy you a drink," he said, indicating a saloon on the opposite side of the road. But Alcat broke in. "What about Madame's?" So they went off to Madame's Toletti's French cafe and ordered ginger beer and lemonade, and Joseph Malone drank tea. That meeting set them on the road, for Malone knew of a digger ill with fever who wished to sell his claim, which was not far from one being worked by Halkett and himself. "How much can you spend?" Malone said. "How much will we need too?" Jack put in. "Between 20 and 30 quid. You could spend hundreds of pounds if you want to go near the center of the hole, but 30'll buy you a decent claim, and I've seen up to 4 carats come out of one in a day." Alcat took an envelope from his pocket and the stub of a pencil. David was never to know a time, even years later, when Alcat could not produce a pencil stub from one pocket or another. And they worked out a scheme in which they could afford to spend 24 pounds on the claim. Hire one black boy to dig. Buy the minimum amount of gear, including a rocking sieve called a baby. Put down 3 months' rent on a bell tent. Buy a couple of camp stretchers and blankets, and have enough left over to buy food, fuel, and water to last the same time. It meant simply that they were committed for 3 months. If they found nothing, they would have to think again. The sick man lived on the outskirts of the diggers' main camp, between it and the hovels of shanties in which the blacks lived. It was a kind of slum area, the place you ended up if the luck was bad. A mixture of tar paper shacks and one room dwellings of old packing cases and tents that had seen better days, all festering in the burning afternoon sunshine. The digger's name was Sandyson, and he lay on a grass-filled palisade on the floor on his tent in a temperature of more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet he was shivering. He was in his 30s, but looked 60. His body was thin and wasted, and whites of his eyes were a dirty yellow. His boy, a large black man, was sponging his naked body. "This is Mackintosh," Sanderson said. The washing seemed to make him feel better. "Mackintosh gave us all to dram. I shouldn't be drinking it. My liver's gone to pot, but there's no hope anyhow, so it does no matter." He drained his mug. "So, you want to buy the claim? Can you afford 30? "Yes," Jack said, without consulting David. "It's no wonderful claim. I've had a few carrots out of it, enough to live on, but it hasn't made me rich. Still, who's to tell what'll happen? For 30 you can have all this." He indicated the tent, a large carpenter's chest, which contained his food supplies. "And then there's Mackintosh. Could you take him on? We'd be starting immediately." "Could you give me a day or two?" "I don't think you'd be leaving that soon," David said. "Leaving?" He reached out and poured himself half a cup of whiskey. "Leaving? Don't be soft, man. I'm finished. Done. I'll now be living here. I've only a day or so left. That's why I want to sell. I want a good grave and a good headstone. And I want my name on the headstone. I've paid for the grave, but not the stone. Mackintosh has got the paper for that. It's all written down. Name, place of birth, date of birth, James MacIver Sanderson, born Moy in the county of Inverness, 27 to 1843, died, etc., etc. And nothing sentimental, no bits of verse, just "he was a digger" at the bottom. It's all written down. He swallowed the whiskey and lay back. The sweat burst out on him again. "At least they'll know," he said. "Who?" "The people who walk in the graveyard and look at the headstone. At least they'll know I was alive." Sanderson died at evening 2 days later. Much of that time Jack spent at his bedside. They buried him the next day, and David accompanied Mackintosh to the stonemason and arranged for the inscription on the headstone. The day after that they started their work on the diggings, the Cade/Farson partnership had begun. My goodness.